We're going to talk about something we talk about a lot because we're getting a lot of it, and that's inflation. But there's still a lot of confusion out there. And the first time, or early in my years when I was studying about this stuff and reading Austrian economics and reading Mises, there was this debate going on. What is inflation? And he was arguing in Human Action that you shouldn't look at inflation as prices going up. That's a consequence of inflation. And he said, what you should look at is what the Fed is doing, what they're doing with the money supply. And I agreed with that. But he gave the explanation. I said, well, why don't you just, recognize and say, well, there's prices going up and there's money supply going up. And he says it has a real serious purpose of doing this. Because if you get the people thinking about prices and not about increasing the money supply, then you don't have to think in a responsible manner about economics and why the Federal Reserve does these things. Like, is there debt going around? Yeah, Congress runs up debt. It's bipartisan, and then they need the money and they have to borrow and they don't have enough, so they go to the Fed and then they get to print it. And so they don't want that to be known. Everybody knows it, but they don't want to talk about it because the common man would know. He says, well, that's what inflation is all about. And the other thing, that's an economic argument of explaining why they do it. But the other one is that I think we don't hardly ever talk about, that we don't deal with inflation as a moral issue. And I think the founders, alluded to anything the government prints, and they advise no printed press money, is a crime. It's a criminal offense. So this is what it should be. It should be a moral issue, and they should be called counterfeiters. And I would do that, in the Congress when I was talking to the Federal Reserve Board people, because I thought they were the facilitators. They would counterfeit money and give license to the Congress and a lot of other people. It's easy for people to understand that if Congress wants to spend money, and it's a bipartisan agreement, and one side pretends at different times that they really don't believe in it, they believe in fiscal sanity, they just go ahead and do it because both sides want welfare and warfare, and both sides want the Federal Reserve, and both sides, support the idea of big government. So this is something that has been going on and lasts for a long time, but I think we should deal with it, Chris, more as a moral issue. It is counterfeiting. The founders actually thought that counterfeiters of government official papers deserved the death penalty, so they were hardcore on this issue. Now you get canceled and you get threatened if you come up and say, there's something wrong with this system, and if you challenge the system and challenge the status quo of big government, you can get into big trouble. You don't even get a pass and say, well, this is just an intellectual discussion and this is just part of the First Amendment. We should be allowed to discuss this thing. But on inflation, you have to listen to the demagogues because that's all that you hear, unless a few people like we do here, but in many other places with the Mises Institute and quite a few other people will tell the truth. And I think on the very negative side, we see it happening and the monetary system just about in tatters. At the same time, more and more people are waking up. So there's good news and bad news, and I hope we can give some good news to the people that are listening and tuning in, because it's too easy to see the bad news. But what we're dealing with now is the distortion. Why do they lie? Do they have a purpose in lying? Yes, they do.
Inflation is created by the Federal Reserve, as you say, by counterfeiting money, and then problems are multiplied with shortages with government interference in the economy. And Americans used to understand this. We've seen in all the movies and books, and we've seen pictures of bread lines in other countries. This is inflation and government interference. And people would, in our early republic especially, do anything to get to America, literally, because it was here that government used to intervene the least. But alas, all that changed in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The ideas switched to government would be involved in everything. And, gave them 29 years and we were already in the Great Depression. That was, again, inflation from the Federal Reserve, which was created in 1913. So 15 years later, we had the Great Depression. And during that time, it was the first time with Hoover that the government would intervene massively into the economy to try to, quote unquote, fix it. And that was followed by FDR. And, the rest of the story we know. So the Fed and government intervention created and extended the Great Depression. We are in the same exact story today. It's just on a much bigger scale. Great Depression was peanuts compared to what we're dealing with today. We have the Fed printing trillions of dollars and government literally everywhere you look. So we can have a much greater depression if we follow the same ideas, or what this show preaches, let's change our ideas to sound money, free markets, and let's avoid a greater depression.
The point you were making there that I think is very interesting and very important, they're involved in everything. Even if they said we only tinker with interest rates, and they tinker with a lot more because they bail out their friends and subsidize the people by monetizing the debt. But no, they get involved in everything. But if it was only the interest rate, there is a tremendous amount of interference with the interest rate because it's the most important price in a free market. The free market has to have information. Are people saving enough money to encourage people to invest? Who does that? That's old-fashioned. What do you think? Capital comes from savings? No. Capital comes from the Federal Reserve, and then they pass it out to their friends. But they have to lie about that, and the lying comes out so often with statistics. And there's a favorite person that I like, and he actually testified before Congress for me when I was on the banking committee, and that is John Williams, who has a web page and does a letter on this subject, a good Austrian economist. And he has a program called Shadow Stats. He follows everything, and he's known for checking out where the prices would be if they stick to the rules. Because there was a time they would measure certain items in the CPI, and then it was growing too fast, so they would change it around and cut out some of the things that were growing, increasing too fast. So they're always manipulating it. And the other thing that they do routinely, even after that manipulation comes, on the day they're going to announce it, the investors are just looking for the key words. What word will move the markets? And they know that the Fed is their friend, so all the announcements will be designed to prop up the market. So they come in and they say the market will do this, and they keep doing. They're very positive on this. And one thing that they do is they deceive people. Now, John Williams, what he did was he looked back 20 years or so, and he has followed this. But this year, last week or so, the announcement was that CPI was going up at 5%. Well, in the 70s, it went up a lot faster than that. And yet they say, well, but the core rate, they'll argue, well, the CPI is 2%, but the core rate is going up much more. The core rate, which you're supposed to ignore, has to do with food and energy, which is a pretty big hunk out of people's, routine budget. So they do that, and then they make it sound better because the sound bites are what really moves the market. But they lie about that for a long time.
Before we continue, help us by smashing that YouTube like button and subscribe now to this channel. This shows the algorithm that you value the information, and it helps us spread this message. Sharing is caring. Please like and subscribe now. Thank you. And now, let's continue.
Just think of the lies told about there was no inflation of the money supply from 1933 up till 1971. And that means because we were on a pseudo gold standard, and to a degree internationally they were following this. But eventually everybody caught on to it, and by 1971 everybody knew they were lying about it. They said gold was $35 an ounce. So as soon as they removed the controls on rigging the price or the ratio, all of a sudden it exploded, and the ratio went up to $800 an ounce. So, but that was important. That set the psychology there. But of course, the 70s was a really, really tough, decade. But right now, they're running out of steam and lying and fooling the people because inflation, the kind that they talk about, prices are going up much too rapidly, and the people are knowing about it. And you cannot blame the Fed, and you can't blame the people who are passing out largesse, taking care of the welfareists, the rich and the poor, and therefore they can't attack that. So they make up stories about it, and there'll be somebody's making too much profits. Labor unions cause the inflation, but no, the real machinery is in the Federal Reserve, which was started in 1913, and as long as we have that, we're going to have distortion. But my argument has been that eventually it will self-destruct, and that's what we're witnessing now, the initial disintegration of this whole organization that the Federal Reserve is running right now, because you just can't believe that you're really paying the bills if you're allowed to just print money and pay the bill. Eventually people lose confidence. And you know, even before the lockdown occurred due to COVID, the cycle was at the point where people were experiencing the fact that the Fed had run out through the cycle, interest rates had to come out, and things were turning downward. And then the two came together, and it really was a calamity, and that really incited them to inflate the money supply like never before. And they did this believing that you know, this would save them, and it's different this time. And I would say they've always argued that over the many years. It's different this time. Prosperity is here forever. But I would agree with them this time. It's different this time. It's much worse than even how Chris described what was going on in the Depression. But the Depression was an effort. In 1921, there was a depression, and they allowed it to run its course, and there was a lot of liquidation of debt. They allowed the bankruptcies because people were bankrupt, but you're not allowed to bankrupt. But there's still a liquidation of debt. The struggle is between the market liquidation of debt or whether or not we're going to do it honestly. If you did it, if you're an individual and you run into trouble, if you're an honest person, you say, well, I got to get out of this debt. I'm bankrupt. I'm going to get another job. I'm going to start paying the bills, and you liquidate the debt so you can get back on your feet again. But a country never does that. So we're not going to liquidate debt like they did in the 30s in 1931. But what they did was they liquidated the debt, and they set the plan, and that was why Roosevelt immediately took us off the gold standard, is so that they could print money like crazy. So they liquidated debt by devaluing the currency. So if you double the money supply, in general theory, you say, oh, I only have half as much debt because the money's only worth half. But that's how they will liquidate the debt, and that's what we expect. But people get into trouble in spite of all this money. People are in a lot of trouble, and we have shortages going on, and we have shortages of labor going on because we have so much inflation, you know, to take care of the welfare. So they're there, but there's the shortage of labor going in, and they expect that this is something where the people interpret it as, oh, prices are going up. I'm out of my I'm over my budget. I even had this assistance. Bread is going up too fast, and the core inflation isn't telling the truth. And they say their conclusion is, I don't have enough money. So they'll beg and plead, and the politician responds, oh, we'll get you some more money. And they do. They get the government to print up more money, making the problems worse. Temporarily, it seems to help, but eventually, just getting more money printed and passing it out will exactly do the opposite. And we're sort of moving into that area now where the more they're printing, especially over this past year, the worse the economic conditions have gotten, except for the closest friends of the Fed, and that's the banking industry and the corporate industry, the military-industrial complex. So corporatism is alive and well because that's where the money's going, rather than having the market deal with it. Markets want to deflate and get the debt down as quickly as possible. Governments want to get rid of the debt by deflating the dollar and thinking that that's a better way of doing it. On short term, they're right. People like that much better. But then the people get upset because eventually, holy man, look at what I'm paying for a loaf of bread. Then it finally dawns on them, maybe it's right. Maybe it is related to the deficits that we're running up, and a light bulb goes on. Well, we would hope a whole lot of light bulbs go on and we change our policies.